Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on addressing the economic challenges of Americans with disabilities, findings from the 2013 FDIC National Survey of Unbanked and Underbanked Households. My name is Michael Rausch, and I'm the Director of the Real Economic Impact Network at the National Disability Institute. Before we get started with today's webinar, I would like to turn this over to my colleague, Nakia Matthews, who will be going over some housekeeping tips for us before we get started. Nakia?
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. The audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer. Please make sure that your speakers are turned on or your headphones are plugged in. You can control the audio broadcast via the audio broadcast panel. If you accidentally close this panel or if the sound stops, you can reopen the audio broadcast panel by going to the Communicate menu at the top of your screen and choosing Join Audio Broadcast. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer, or if you prefer to listen by phone, you can dial the toll or toll-free number that you see here and enter the meeting code. Please note that you do not need to enter an attendee ID. Real-time captioning is provided during this webinar. To access the captions, you can click the Media Viewer button in the upper right-hand corner of your webinar platform. For some of you, it may already be open, and for Mac users, the panel is already open in the lower right corner of the webinar screen. If you would like to make the Media Viewer panel larger, you can minimize some of the other panels like chat or Q&A. And conversely, if you do not need captions, you can minimize the Media Viewer panel. We will have some time for questions at the end of the webinar. Please use the chat box or the Q&A box to send any questions you have during the course of the webinar to either Michael Rausch or to me, Nakia Matthews, and we will direct those questions to our speaker during the Q&A portion. If you are listening by phone and not logged into the web portion, you may also ask a question by emailing it directly to Michael Rausch at mrausch@ndi-inc.org. Please note this webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the NDI website. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar today, please use the chat box to send me a message, or you may email me directly at nmatthews@ndi-inc.org. And now we'll turn it back over to Michael.
Thank you, Nakia. And thank you all again for attending today's webinar. For those of you who are new to NDI, to the National Disability Institute, I would like to share with you a little bit of information on our organization. The National Disability Institute is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to building a better economic future for Americans with disabilities. We are the first national organization committed exclusively to championing economic empowerment, asset development, and financial stability for all persons across the full spectrum of disabilities. National Disability Institute affects change through public education, training, technical assistance, and policy development to help the 1 in 3 Americans with disabilities living in poverty take steps towards brighter financial futures. To learn more about the National Disability Institute, please go to www.realeconomicimpact.org. We hope that if you're not already a member or a partnering organization of the Real Economic Impact Network, we hope that you will join us and be a part of this national movement on building a better economic future for persons with disabilities. The Real Economic Impact Network is an alliance of organizations and individuals dedicated to advancing the economic empowerment of people with disabilities. The network consists of more than 4,500 members located throughout the United States. That includes nonprofit organizations, community tax coalitions, asset development organizations, financial education initiatives, corporations and private sector businesses, federal, state, local governments, and agencies, as well as individuals and their families with disabilities. All partners join forces to embrace, promote, and pursue access to and the inclusion of people with disabilities within the economic mainstream. To learn more about the REI network, please go to our website at www.realeconomicimpact.org, and you can sign up for the network on our homepage. We're fortunate today to have the Executive Director and Founder of the National Disability Institute, Michael Morris, who is going to share information with us as well as some highlights from a report that the National Disability Institute released in April titled Addressing the Economic Challenges of Americans with Disabilities, Highlights from NDI's Banking and Disability Report. With that, I would now like to turn this over to Michael Morris. Michael?
Thanks, Michael, and thank you all for joining with us from around the country and your participation in the Real Economic Impact Network. What I'm going to share with you today are highlights from a research project we did in the earlier part of this year, 2015, to understand better about the banking status and financial behavior of households that are headed up by a person who self-identifies with one or more disabilities. The methodology behind this study builds on survey work that was done by the FDIC in conjunction with the U.S. Census Bureau. What was involved is interviews with over 54,000 households across the country. 12.2% of the households that were interviewed did self-identify with a disability. We're going to share with you 6 key areas of the analysis of the data. What did we learn? First, about banking status. The second, about checking and savings account ownership and automatic transfer of funds. The third is prepaid debit cards, their use. The fourth is alternative financial services and their use by people with disabilities. The fifth area is the access to mobile phones and internet. And the final is about banking methods, both using online and mobile banking, as well as more traditional access to banking and mainstream financial services. So let's look first at what did we learn about banking status. Well, let's look at this in terms of those households headed up by a person with disability identified as less likely than those households headed up by a person without a disability. They were less likely to be married. They were less likely to be Hispanic or Latino or Asian, less likely to have a college degree, less likely to be employed, and less likely to earn more than $30,000 a year, and less likely to own their own home. What did we learn was they were more likely to be unmarried or living alone, more likely to be female than male, more likely to be persons of color, African American or Native American or Alaskan Natives. They were more likely to be older, between 55 to 64 years of age. They were more likely to have a high school degree or less rather than having some college or a college degree or a post-college graduate degree. They were more likely not to be in the labor force, and they were more likely to earn less than $30,000 a year. The FDIC, in their use of different terms, talks about people who are fully banked, people who are underbanked, and people who are unbanked. Fully banked means someone in the household currently has an account and not use alternative financial services in the last 12 months. What that means is anything from predatory lenders to pawn shops to a variety of what would not be considered mainstream traditional financial services. Underbanked means someone in the household has an account, but still use alternative financial services at least once in the last 12 months. And then unbanked means nobody in the household had checking or savings account. So here's, in these two pie graphs, you can see some of the comparison between the households headed by a person with a disability versus households that were headed by a person without a disability. And what you'll see is when you add up the slices of the pie is that almost 1 in 2 people with disabilities were more likely to be unbanked or underbanked. You'll see that for people without disabilities, that almost 67% are fully banked, as compared to, on the disability side, only 48%. And then in terms of unbanked, almost twice the number, actually more than twice the number, 7.2% of households headed by a person without a disability were unbanked, 18.4% of households headed by a person with a disability were unbanked. So some pretty stark contrasts. We also learned about reasons for opening an account. And we see that for people with disabilities, the majority, the 50%, the reason they opened an account was because they wanted to receive a direct deposit. And we learned from the answers to other questions that most often related to a public benefit like Social Security, and in some cases that related to their paycheck. What did we learn about, future banking plans by disability status? And here again, what you see is that by a very significant percentage, almost 50%, almost 50% of the people with disabilities said that it was very unlikely that they were going to be opening an account in the future. What does all of this tell us? Several things. Well, first, there is less account ownership by people with disabilities. We see that they're more likely to use their account ownership for direct deposit of a paycheck or like a Social Security benefit payment. We see that they're less likely to want to or indicate their interest in wanting to rejoin the banking system. And we see also that one of the reasons they gave for not participating in the banking system was simply a lack of financial resources. Let's go to the second topic. Checking and savings account ownership and automatic transfers, households headed by working-age persons with disabilities. Here again, what we learn is that people with disabilities, again, disproportionately unbanked, disproportionately have savings accounts, and disproportionately have checking accounts. And when you look at the numbers comparing disability with non-disability heads of households, you see again that in terms of savings, twice as likely a household headed by a person with a disability is going to have a savings account, and in terms of checking, again, more than twice as likely the household headed by a person without a disability having a checking account. And the stark contrast is really in comparing the two types of households around checking and savings account. 41% households with disabilities have both, but compare that with almost 71% of households headed by a person without a disability. What does this tell us? Well, clearly, again, we have some real challenges ahead of us in terms of educating consumers with disabilities about the importance of saving and the importance of using the mainstream traditional financial service delivery system. Let's look at prepaid cards, prepaid debit cards. And here again, we learn what are the reasons for use of prepaid cards by households headed by people with disabilities. And you see, again, the differences. Most significant is the households headed by people without disabilities are more likely to send money to someone else. They're also better at looking at how they're using funds for a variety of other reasons. It's interesting, too, where do people with disabilities purchase or first gain or acquire prepaid cards? And here again, what you see is that people with disabilities are in many cases, similar to people without disabilities, purchasing them at retail or department stores, also getting them at grocery, liquor, convenience stores, drug stores. But you also see that they sometimes, in a more significant way, are getting these cards from non-bank financial service stores, which might be a check cashing place, and less likely to get it from a bank branch. What does all this tell us? That despite direct deposit use by people with disabilities, there's still a disincentive to work and generate income. There's inconsistent banking relationships. And so here again is some of the education challenges that we face in building the knowledge and skills of individuals with disabilities to understand the safety, the security, maybe also the savings in money in terms of using the traditional banking system. We've got quite a ways to go. How about alternative financial services? Here again, we see a disproportionate use of alternative financial services, more likely to have used them in the last 12 months, more likely to have used them in the last 30 days, and that's almost by 2 to 1. Types of alternative financial services, people with disabilities are more likely to use them for basic transactions, and they're more likely to use them as a means of gaining access to credit and use of money. The number of alternative financial services used by people with disabilities significantly more frequently, as well as type. Use 3 or more, 4.8 versus 2.7 for people without disabilities. What does all this tell us? Once again, people with disabilities seem to be more comfortable using alternative financial services and using more than one type, seem to be less educated and informed that there is less financial security and actually may lead to increased costs, and the use of alternative financial services may in fact compound their financial insecurity. What about access to mobile phones and internet? Again, let's look at households headed by working age persons with disabilities as compared to households without, and again, we see some stark contrast. First, it's to notice that in terms of no access to mobile phones, let alone smartphones, by more than 2 to 1, people with disabilities don't even have access to mobile phones. When you look at the numbers around smartphones, also very, very significant discrepancies by almost 2 to 1. People without disabilities using smartphones now, people without disabilities in this survey and this data not. And so again, this is going to play out, as you'll see in the next few slides, where people with disabilities have not jumped on the bandwagon of mobile and internet banking. Internet access by people with disabilities, what you'll see again is significantly less access, and that number is stark, 31.5% versus 11.2%. Here's a graph that's depicting how people are using mobile banking, comparing people with disabilities to people without. And what you'll see, again, is some similarities in terms of using mobile banking to check balances or for conducting transactions, as well as downloading or using a bank mobile app. Not that great a discrepancy or variance around bill payments or transferring money between accounts, or even simply trying to locate the nearest ATM. Not that great a difference in how they're using mobile banking. However, remember the prior graph showing the access to mobile banking, stark variances, stark contrast. People with disabilities just simply don't have this access. What does this tell us? Less access to mobile phones, including smartphones and internet, particularly among unbanked households in terms of people with disabilities. Disparities in access to technologies is clearly impacting the ability to use mobile and online financial services. And then finally, we need to learn a lot more about the accessibility of these new technologies, whether it's mobile banking or internet banking. Those questions were not asked in this FDIC survey, and may also lead to some of the reasons we're seeing less use by people with disabilities, but there's a lot more we need to learn. And then finally, category 6, banking methods. So what we see here is, this is what is your method to access your account. And here, not much difference in terms of use of bank tellers, use of ATMs, but then look at the difference here in this chart. Online banking, people with disabilities, only about 42%, versus online banking, people without disabilities, over 65%, quite significant. Not much difference around telephone banking, but here again, mobile banking, big difference. Twice the number, twice the percent mobile banking by people without disabilities, only 13.8% by people with disabilities as compared to 29.5% people without disabilities. Primary method for accessing a bank account, and this again reflective of the lack of use of internet access to financial services, mobile banking access. So what you see here are people with disabilities disproportionately still going into that local neighborhood retail branch as compared to people without disabilities. Not that much difference in terms of access to ATM, but here again, the variance on online banking and significantly mobile banking, 3 to 1 variance, 3 times more likely people without disabilities compared to people with disabilities using mobile banking. So what does all this tell us? Well, as I have said in describing to you what we've learned, people with disabilities really are not there yet in the use of online and mobile banking, And we know that people with disabilities face some significant transportation access issues with reduced ability to get to banks. The opportunity currently and in the future to bring people with disabilities into comfortable use of online and mobile banking where you can access anytime, anywhere financial services is a huge upside. It could overcome the transportation limitations. People could do it from their phone. They could do it from their computer in their home and would worry less about how am I going to get to that nearest neighborhood bank branch. So there's an upside here in terms of thinking about where the future may go and what we can do, and you'll hear about this in the recommendations, to get people with disabilities more comfortable with greater access to affordable and accessible online and mobile banking. This report is available from the NDI website. I've quickly touched on many of the major points that we've learned and hope it's given you some insights in perspective, whether you're a person with a disability, whether you work within a disability organization, or you're working within one of the many nonprofits we collaborate with that are working with people with and without disabilities, people at low and moderate income level, to bring them into the economic mainstream, the financial mainstream. I hope you will go to our website, realeconomicimpact.org, and you will find this report. Before we go to questions, I do want to share with you, well, this is a lot of data we crunched. Thanks to the FDIC that gave us access to the data, thanks to JP Chase, which funded us to be able to complete this research study. But now that we know what we know, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it at a national level? What are we going to do about it at a state level? What are we going to do about it at a community level? A framework to evaluate economic inclusion, and I want to give credit to the FDIC and a committee and working group they have on economic inclusion that broke down the issues of economic inclusion into three major areas: access, sustainability, and growth. Well, what do we mean by that? Access is about drawing consumers into the banking system and mainstream financial services. That clearly, from the data we reviewed, that's a problem for people with disabilities and other low and moderate income individuals and households headed by people with and without disabilities. Sustainability is, well, once we've drawn you in, we need to help keep you there. What FDIC has learned is more than was previously realized, people go in and out of the banking system, traditional banking services. And the underbanked represents people who both have checking accounts, but are still very dependent and using quite regularly non-traditional alternative financial services, which are potentially not very secure, potentially may cost more money. And then third is, beyond sustainability, is growth. How do we deepen that banking relationship beyond checking, beyond just transactions, to looking at other consumer financial services, whether that comes over into access to credit, or it has to do with investing, or the whole portfolio of types of financial services really is what we mean when we talk about deepening banking relationships. We propose recommendations regarding all three areas: access, sustainability, and growth. So recommendation number one regarding access: drawing consumers with disabilities into mainstream financial services. Many of you know, perhaps all of you know, that in just a few weeks across the country, and certainly here in Washington, D.C., we will be celebrating the 25th anniversary on July 26th since the signing of the ADA in 1990. We propose as a first recommendation that the FDIC, working with a variety of financial institutions, working with other federal agencies, pull together a financial toolkit that could accelerate the development of responsive, affordable, and accessible financial services for people with disabilities being available from financial institutions, whether one entered a local neighborhood retail store or one looked at financial service options online from FDIC-insured financial institutions, that there would be a host of options that seem both affordable and responsive to the needs of people with disabilities. We hope to continue talking with the FDIC and some of the other federal agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and others at the Department of the Treasury. This seems to us an appropriate undertaking, an appropriate initiative, particularly in this year, 25 years after the passage of the ADA. Many of you have probably seen changes that have taken place in the world around us that is certainly more inclusive. Many physical, communication, and programmatic barriers have been reduced, if not eliminated. But one of the purpose statements of the ADA was to advance economic self-sufficiency. Access to mainstream financial services, helping people with disabilities make informed financial decisions are a part of what we think it means to advance economic self-sufficiency. A toolkit like this would be of great help to many, many financial institutions, sort of a roadmap for them that would ultimately help the end user, the potential customer with a disability. The approach to how would this toolkit be created, we have proposed that the FDIC, with their Advisory Committee on Economic Inclusion, create a time-limited work group to identify best practices. Many of you in your local communities are engaged with financial institutions who are doing wonderful, innovative, creative, impactful services and offering responsive products to people with disabilities at low and moderate income level. If we collect those, and those could be put into a financial toolkit and then disseminated to the banks and the disability community across the country, we think we could respond to some of the findings in this study. Access, area number 2. Well, if we draw people in, we also need to go further in terms of thinking about consumers with disabilities in mainstream financial services. A key part to all of this is people with disabilities need to earn more money. One of the reasons they gave why they're not using banks was they didn't have enough money. They weren't worried about really where they put their money. A potential recommendation we offered is that financial institutions held themselves out as model employers, proactively really sought to hire, first to recruit, hire, accommodate, and retain and offer career pathways for individuals with disabilities. An approach to meeting this is many financial institutions also are 503 federal contractors, and we have new rules as of last year where federal contractors have an obligation to hit a 7% utilization goal in the hiring of qualified individuals with disabilities, that banks, one at a time, but really put pressure on their peers to make a public commitment to increase the recruitment, hiring, accommodation, and advancement of people with disabilities within their workforce in diverse types of jobs, that they engage disability and career service offices and college campuses to expand the recruitment of people with disabilities, that they expand internships opportunities, which is usually the best path in terms of an individual getting known within a potential workforce, and then that leading to a job, and that banks and financial institutions use the structure of a central pool of funds to affirmatively support accommodation needs. Sustainability, keeping consumers with disabilities in the banking system. Our first recommendation is to integrate financial capability skills building within the workforce development service delivery system. Here again is a great place where all of these issues and opportunities come together. There are American Job Centers, sometimes called workforce resource centers, one-stop career centers in virtually every community across the country, ultimately funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. This is where people with and without disabilities get assistance in skills development, but also in locating jobs they might apply for, and their skills might match up with the requirements. Our approach is to seize the new opportunity under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act with its focus on financial literacy that might involve a collaboration of the U.S. Department of Labor with the FDIC, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Social Security Administration, and other federal agencies to figure out how can we bring to the one-stops, those American Job Centers, programs like Money Smart, which was created by the FDIC, and you can find on their website, and financial counseling and coaching, bring it into the American Job Centers, and also think about the way financial institutions could collaborate with their local workforce development boards to make financial literacy education activities available. Improve the ability of job seekers to make informed financial decisions and enhance their financial well-being. A second recommendation related to sustainability and keeping consumers with disabilities in the banking system is to foster ABLE accounts for down payments on financial inclusion. Many of you may not be familiar with ABLE, another law passed last year. ABLE is an acronym, stands for Achieving a Better Life Experience. It will allow millions of individuals with disabilities and their families to create ABLE accounts, which are tax-advantaged savings accounts. The money can then come out, income made on investment, tax-free, that can be used for quite an array of purposes: education, housing, transportation, healthcare, technology purchase. So here's another opportunity to bridge several different worlds and make, from a banking standpoint, ABLE-sensitive products and services available as a new pathway to mainstream financial inclusion. The final area is growth, deepening banking relationships. Recommendation 1 is to target the economic inclusion of potential of mobile financial services. And this we talked about as I reviewed the findings in the report. We need to understand more about accessibility challenges of mobile and internet financial products and services. We need to target younger groups for marketing and outreach in the disability community to educate them about the value proposition of mobile banking. And we need to build collaboration between the FDIC and the Federal Communications Commission at a federal level and at a state level, so that we try to solve this set of issues around affordability and accessibility of products, access to high-speed internet, to improve pathways to economic inclusion. And then our final recommendation is to deepen banking relationships with customers with disabilities, generate new financial knowledge about people with disabilities that will help better inform what is the roadmap, the pathways to economic inclusion. We propose expanding the data to be collected. In the future, FDIC collects this data every 2 years. We'd love to understand more about people by different disability status. We'd love to understand more about when people with disabilities says that they're using mainstream banking to make direct deposits from public benefits and other sources of income, breaking that into several different questions so we can understand it better. And there's a need for smaller scale qualitative research, interviews with one-on-one small groups to really understand and dig deeper about some of these findings. What's keeping people with disabilities away from mainstream banking? Why are they more comfortable with alternative financial services? What will it take to get them to be more active users of mobile and internet-related financial service delivery? Conclusion, what have I tried to impress upon you today? What do the numbers tell us? 8.9 million adults and 2.4 million children living in unbanked and underbanked households headed by a working-age person with a disability. More likely using alternative financial services, more likely using prepaid debit cards, less likely using mobile financial services. In this one slide, I think what I've tried to capture for you, these are the challenges, but these also represent the opportunities. Why does it matter? When federally insured depository institutions effectively serve their broadest possible set of consumers, including people with disabilities, public confidence is strengthened in the banking system, which ultimately benefits all of us. So I hope in this rapid review of both the findings and the recommendations, you have a sense of what you may get into discussion with, conversations with at a state level, federal level, or in your own community with financial institutions to expand their reach and truly to make sure that people with disabilities are considered as potential customers. This slide, last slide, just is sharing that there are a variety of policy changes, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, Section 503, ABLE. I all shared with you some of those during this presentation. There's also the new activity by FICO to recalculate credit scores that looks at some of the alternative sources for data. And we know that the FCC is looking at the need for more people to have affordable access to the internet and smartphones. So there's a lot of promising trends and policies as a framework that are making the difference today. And finally, what can we do? This is the year, as I said, the 25th anniversary of the ADA. It's time for us to urgently focus on some of these ideas as solutions, and whether you're working at a community level, a state level, or a national level, to think of who could I involve, who can I engage, how can we develop a collective impact agenda that really takes us back to that purpose statement of the ADA. How do we advance economic self-sufficiency for adults, working-age adults with disabilities in this country? You are part of the solution, and I hope I've given you some ideas to think about I'm ready, Michael Rausch and Nakia. If there are questions, I will certainly try to answer them.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Yes, we have a lot of questions, and so we have about 12 minutes to be able to get through as many of them as we can. So let's just get started. So the first question is, did the survey look at bank hours as a barrier to traditional banking services?
So, good question. There was a question asked of these 50,000 plus households about reasons they were not using mainstream banking. And one of the questions asked, is it because of banking hours? And both people with and without disabilities did not indicate that as a significant issue. Anecdotally, I know we at NDI, we do so many different kinds of trainings and education, and that is an issue that comes up, but it did not come up in the survey findings.
Great, thank you. Does bank refer to credit union as well? Are they in the survey?
The FDIC, in its definition of financial institutions, was looking at those institutions that are FDIC insured, which would not include credit unions. So that may be a good distinction, and I do not know, but we should look into whether the National Credit Union Administration, NCUA, has done some surveying which might produce some different results from a standpoint of a customer or households headed up by people with disabilities.
Great. The next question is, did the study look to see how much of this is generational? And my guess on this question is they're looking at, in the sense that, you know, I use a prepaid or a cash checking place because that's what my mother did. That's what my grandmother did. So did the survey look to see if any of this was generational between the generations? Yeah.
Well, in some of those opening slides at the beginning of the presentation, it points out, and I know this, it's discussed in more depth in the report, the households that identified as a head of household a person with a disability were disproportionately older. They were in the over 40 to 60 range. And it did raise questions for me that if one oversampled, another survey that could get at a and it's probably about head of households, but if we were to survey younger people with disabilities, let's just say 18 or 21 to 35, would some of these results be different? I would speculate they might, but we don't know.
Great. So the next question is, it's asking, excuse me, there's an issue with using online banking or smartphones for low-income individuals, that it is also found that individuals need access to funds immediately, and usually there is a 24-hour waiting period to be able to access the funds. Was this part of the research, and could this also be a recommendation to take back to financial institutions?
Yeah.
That's a regulatory issue.
Yeah, I think there's multiple parts there. One, I think it's an excellent point. There might be, as they look at modifying questions for the next, survey of households they do, which I think will be done in 2016. I would say that that's worth exploring. But it may also be, it also has to do with banking practices and may even get into regulatory issues. But it was not a question that I saw was covered.
Okay, great. The next question is, how can it be concluded that those who use prepaid cards have a disincentive to work and generate income?
Can you repeat that, Michael?
Sure. So how can it be concluded that those who use prepaid cards have a disincentive to work and generate income? I think that's relating back to one of the earlier slides that you gave.
Yeah, I'm confused by the question. I'm sorry.
Okay. No problem.
Yeah.
We can come back and address that one, so
okay.
no problem.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem. A few states have made financial literacy classes mandatory for high school graduates or other programs. How can persons with disabilities best access financial literacy? Is it legislative action or CIL action or non-government organization action?
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably all of the above. There are, I think, a majority of states have passed state laws that require either a certain number of hours or a course before students graduate from high school. Unfortunately, in some states who have moved that kind of legislation forward and it's become the law, there sometimes is exemptions or waivers of students with disabilities who might be in special education classes, and that's very unfortunate. I do think that the area we're going to see the most gain is, as I mentioned, in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. There are new requirements for youth with and without disabilities to have access to financial literacy education activities. And that doesn't serve as many students as the school system. And the priority in the workforce development system is for out-of-school youth. 75% of funds have to go to out-of-school youth. But so I still think it's a place to consider and get to know what's going on with your local workforce development board. But then outside all the public policy framework, what an opportunity to sit down with your local bank, your local credit union, the financial institutions in your community. I don't know that I know of any financial institution that has not invested in some strategy, some proactive approach to financial education and promoting financial literacy. Many banks have created their own program, like Bank of America that we work with, Better Money Habits. Other banks have their version of a financial literacy program. Many of the financial institutions make available on a volunteer basis their employees or associates to come to your program, whether it's a Center for Independent Living or another type of nonprofit agency, whether it's an agency exclusively for people with disabilities or more of a broader community-based organization. I think there is, if you haven't already been in dialogue with your local bank and or credit union, I think there's quite a bit of opportunity around partnerships, many of which are free, as well as many of those local financial institutions will also make available small mini grants to fund perhaps a collaborative program on financial literacy. So those are some ideas.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I'd just like to add, too, that I would encourage everyone to go to our website at www.realeconomicimpact.org. And if you go under Our Work, click on the tab at the top under Our Work. There you will go to a link that says Financial Education and a Financial Education Toolkit. And you'll see a variety of tools in there that are available on financial education for individuals, specifically with disabilities. So we're going to take one last question comment here, and then unfortunately we're running out of time and won't be able to get through the rest of them. But this goes along with the question that was just asked. And it goes back to, it's asking about the focus or the recommendations. And it says, why is the focus recommendation on workforce development when studies show that to make financial literacy effective, it needs to be introduced to young students? Could a recommendation be added on including this in it says, could recommendation be added? So I'm just saying, can a recommendation be added stating that this needs to be brought to students?
Absolutely. The report is printed. These are the recommendations that are in the report. But more than a publication is what we all do with the data, with the findings of this report. And as I mentioned, we continue to have dialogue with people at Treasury, with people at Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, with FDIC, and Department of Labor, as well as Department of Education, is there's no question financial literacy is something that should begin in really K through 12. It should be brought in early, concepts at a simpler level, and then grow to more sophisticated level. And I know, we know that both NDI and numerous of our community partners that are part of the Real Economic Impact Network do work with your local education agencies, your school systems, as well as the workforce development system to look at ways, how do we work together on these programs? Many of you also work with efforts in coalitions that started around the free tax preparation like we have, but then has broadened out to expand in terms of building individual financial capability. The person who asked the question, I think, is absolutely right. Start at a younger age, early and often, in looking at ways to make an understanding of money management, savings, the meaning of critical terms like debt and credit, building assets, all of it definitely needs to be not an issue that only is faced by adults. It starts early.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. So we have run out of time for questions and answers, and so just to close this out here, in addition to thanking Michael for his time and for bringing this report to all of us, I would like to recognize Nakia Matthews and thank Nakia Matthews for her assistance in putting this webinar together. I also want to recognize the National Disability Institute's Training and Technical Assistance team to give them a shout out for the great work that they are doing day in and day out to build a better economic future for persons with disabilities, but also for assisting to put our webinar series together. So thanks so much to them. We want to encourage you to join the movement and be a part of this conversation, and let's continue this conversation about the importance of bringing this information to persons with disabilities so they can build, individuals can build a better economic future for themselves. So please go to our website and sign up for the Real Economic Impact Network and continue to be a part of this conversation. Our next webinar will be August 12th at 3 p.m., so please join us for that webinar. And also, to find us out on social media, please be sure to connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Flickr, and Tumblr. Again, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today for our webinar, and thanks again to our presenter, Michael Morris, for bringing this information to us today. I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.